Russian President Vladimir Putin has admitted Western sanctions will have a negative medium-term impact on his country. The comments come after months of insisting that punitive measures were not having an effect. Russia is currently the most sanctioned country in the world. Reliable economic data is hard to come by, but it's clear heavy war spending is only adding to pressure on an already fragile economy.
Russia's defense minister inspecting his supply lines. Munitions like the ones manufactured at this plant are in short supply. But buying new weapons is an expensive business, and one Russia is hoping to keep out of the public eye. According to Russian finance minister data, unlisted or classified spending has doubled since last year, indicating around a third of the budget is likely connected to the war effort. $31 billion in total, dwarfing all the other publicly listed government expenses. And Moscow's black budget is ballooning at a time of falling commodity prices, which make up the lion's share of Russia's earnings. Western sanctions also continue to bite, according to Russia's president.
The illegitimate restrictions imposed on the Russian economy in the medium term can indeed have a negative impact. In this regard, we need to ensure a sustainable increase in domestic demand. In this situation, this becomes the leading factor in economic growth.
It's unclear if the Kremlin can kickstart domestic demand. The country officially went into a slight recession last year, with GDP contracting by just over 2%. However, that factors in increased military spending, indicating Russia's domestic consumption is likely faring worse than it seems at first glance. And with more and more arms needed to keep Russia in the fight, Moscow's war machine will likely continue to consume the Kremlin's overtaxed coffers.
For more on this, I'm joined now by Janis Kluge, a Russia expert at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Janis, how significant is Putin's admission that the sanctions are biting?
I found it quite interesting, and I think it's significant because, as you pointed out, Putin was saying the opposite just a couple of weeks ago. So what could this mean? I think it means that Putin is realizing that this war is going to be longer than he anticipated, and that it will be more costly, and that it will also demand a lot more sacrifice from the Russian population. And so I think what he's trying to do right now is to prepare the public and also the elites that this is going to be longer and more expensive than originally thought.
Now, Janis, Western countries have imposed more than 11,000 individual sanctions against Russia since it invaded Ukraine. Which measures have worked and which have not?
I think that each of these measures has a certain effect on the individuals and companies that are targeted. If you ask me for a specific measure that was quite effective, I think it is the oil embargo imposed by the EU. This has really significantly hit the income of the federal budget and is causing the kind of deficits that we are seeing in this data right now. And if you think about sanctions that are probably not having the desired effect, at least not politically in Russia, it is the sanctions on Russian oligarchs. And here, I think the reason is that their influence on the Kremlin and in Russian political decision-making has been, well, I think it has been overestimated in the last years. And I don't think that the sanctions on them will cause any political change or any political impact on Putin's plans regarding the war in Ukraine.
All right. Now, the war has also left Russia increasingly dependent on China. What are the economic risks for Putin being a junior partner to Beijing?
I believe that the main risk is actually a political risk. So, I mean, it undermines Russia's sovereignty because in the future, Russia will have, will depend on China for around half of its imports. And the most important imports are coming from China. So this will have political consequences, but there's also an economic cost. And the economic cost is that China has different goals in this economic relationship with Russia than Putin does. China wants to have a market for its exports and it wants to import resources, while Russia would like to develop its industry and develop technologically in the coming years. And this is under the current circumstances simply not going to happen. And this is the biggest economic risk from this reliance on China for Russia.
All right, Yanis Kluge, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Now, in Russia, publicly criticizing Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine often leads to harsh legal consequences. Most people prefer to voice their discontent in private. The Russian elite is no exception here. But now, one such critical and supposedly confidential conversation between two prominent Russians has surfaced online.
It's a phone call that's got everyone talking. The 30-minute conversation allegedly took place between a very prominent Russian music producer and one of his friends, and it was later leaked, hitting the headlines.
Everything's a mess. He says it's not a big deal. Our army is the most important thing, but we can't rely on it.
He is Russian President Vladimir Putin. His critics, the two men conducting the call, are allegedly music producer Iosif Prigozhin and billionaire Farhad Akhmedov. And they don't pull their punches when it comes to Putin's war against Ukraine and Russia's top military leaders.
Can they hold on to power? No idea. The entire situation is a mess. The country is a mess. Everything is a mess. I don't know. What are we still waiting for, Lera?
Lera is presumably a reference to Prigozhin's wife, Valeria, one of Russia's best-known pop singers. In her Instagram account, she praises her family vacation in Dubai. That country is also mentioned in the controversial telephone call, as is Akhmedov's yacht. Because of such details, many people in Russia believe that the recording is genuine.
It's difficult to fake such a long conversation. A fake conversation would be significantly shorter, and they would have chosen more prominent figures, a minister or someone like that.
The country is all a chatter with the news. Neither Prigozhin nor his oligarch friend has spoken up against the Kremlin in the past. After the recording was released, the music producer said that the conversation had been created using artificial intelligence, even though he conceded that some of the sentences were genuine. Observers aren't convinced. They're wondering just how strong support for President Putin among the Russian elite really is.
The Russian elites have lost an awful lot as a result of this war. They are appalled by what's going on at the moment, but they're remaining tight-lipped and saying nothing. Or they say they support Putin, like Iosif Prigozhin in his public appearances in front of the camera. But as soon as they're together in private, unnoticed by the public, they of course say the whole thing is a disaster.
Yet this dissatisfaction is not dividing the elites. Opposition politician Dmitry Gudkov is convinced, let alone making them prepared to take a stand. Fear is too deep-seated, particularly when such calls are leaked.
A single telephone call is enough for a sort of public execution. The others are then too frightened to even talk about it in their own kitchen.
As well as trying to intimidate critics, the Kremlin also tries to praise those people who back them. They are trying to control the mood in the country with carrot-and-stick tactics. Presidential elections are coming up next year. Who knows whether the war will be over by then or not?
And DW Moscow Bureau Chief Yuri Resheto, who filed that report, joins me now from Riga. That's where the studio relocated after DW was banned from reporting in Russia. Yuri, good to see you. Tell me, how widespread is such critical sentiment among Russian elites really?
Well, there are no reliable polls specifically among the elites, Nicole. Still, I think the critical mood is particularly widespread because the entire Russian elite, that is businessmen, top officials, and even the police and high-ranking military, all of them, of course, lost a lot during this war due to sanctions. Many of them are now unable to travel abroad. Many have lost business, property, yachts, bank accounts, and so on. On the other hand, and here we're talking about specifically people of art in a professional sense, Russia used to be part of world culture, including international show business. Russian artists performed in different countries, had contracts with Western culture institutions, and so on. Now, this is only possible for those who publicly condemned the war and who were, that's why, forced to flee Russia.
In the report, you mentioned the Russians' fear of reprisals to criticism that, is uttered against Putin and his war. What's going to happen to the participants of this apparent leaked call now?
Well, Yosif Prigozhin, from a report, published a short video in which we saw it in the report, said he didn't know how to live with this shit. That's what he said. Now, the FSB Secret Service is reportedly to deal with the case, but it's clear that the easy life is now over for him and his family, as well as for many others in Russia. This week, for example, a father of a schoolgirl in Tula region got 2 years imprisonment. The reason for this was that his daughter had painted an anti-war picture at school. In the girl's picture, there were Russian and Ukrainian flags, and the words "No to War." For this, and for a critical comment on his private social media account, the father was sentenced to 2 years in prison. In another case, Nicole, in St. Petersburg, yesterday, a disabled man who has a disabled child at home was sentenced to 5 years in prison for what they call discrediting the Russian army. He published 3 short critical comments about Putin and the Russian politics on his social media account. And meanwhile, there are supposedly more than 500 Russians sentenced for what they call discrediting the Russian army.
And what effect do such incidents have on the population? Do regular people feel even more intimidated now, or on the contrary, encouraged to criticize the war?
Well, I think, of course, most people are intimidated. Most of them think twice before writing anything or publishing anything critical about Putin and the war. The others are encouraged to be even more critical, but these people mostly leave the country. It's said that several 100,000 Russians have fled in the meantime. Speaking again on the elites, the sanctions have hit them hard, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are now protesting against Putin. On the contrary, many are currently consolidating around the Russian president and are trying to reposition their business in Russia, which they had lost abroad. They invest now in Russia. I think Russia is still a long way from a split in the elites. Most are loyal to Putin, both out of fear and for very pragmatic reasons.
DW Moscow Bureau Chief Yuri Reshetto joining us from Riga. Thank you.